Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. Today we have another review of a book kindly gifted to me by the author. This is Bound by Blood by Shawn Brink. This is the second book that Shawn has sent me, the first one being Pets for Legion. I shall link that above if you want to check out my review of that one. I enjoyed that one quite a bit. This one comes in at just under 300 pages. It is once again a Christian horror, and this released back in August of 2024. As always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end of the video. Let's dive in. Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. Today we have another review of a book kindly gifted to me by the author. This is Bound by Blood by Shawn Brink. This is the second book that Shawn has sent me, the first one being Pets for Legion. I shall link that above if you want to check out my review of that one. I enjoyed that one quite a bit. This one comes in at just under 300 pages. It is once again a Christian horror, and this released back in August of 2024. As always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end of the video. Let's dive in. Most of the character work focus is understandably on the twins of Jason and Seth, although there are a few other characters that get a little bit more rounding out as well. In terms of the two twins then, you have a really interesting nature versus nurture sort of thing going on. They're both from the same humble beginnings in a household that was very, not quite abusive necessarily, but was certainly not a fun place to live, with a father who had left, a mother who was a substance abuser and was having to feed their addiction all the time, and the fallout from those things. And that you had this situation where one stayed behind to try and look after the mum and make the best of things as long as they could, whereas the other, in Jason, left and fell into the cult at an early age. And very much you have this cult brainwashing going on a little bit with Jason and these sort of ideas of glory. And the character work really does kick in after everything falls apart, after Seth has taken part in the attempt to fetch the prophecy to bear, and his break and his discovery of God. And you kind of fast forward a little bit through Seth's discovery. You jump a year, so you have the initial discovery, and when we go back to him, very much entrenched in his religious beliefs, although there is still an element of doubt there, especially brought about by their brother, who they believe may well be dead at this point. Jason is perhaps more interesting in many regards, as he is so morally compromised and brainwashed, but it becomes clear the further into the book we go that this is less a case of him being truly devoted to the cause of the spirits and to Lucifer himself, and is more a case of how people cope with their own failure and the fear that can then be repented onto them. And that is actually a really, really powerful through line for him. This belief that because of what he has already done, he will never be forgiven, and he can't, in his own head, understand why Jesus would forgive, does make his character arc really, really compelling. I don't feel quite the same strength as Seth's. There was a couple of really interesting sequences early on, but you do have a level of dogged religious belief there that pulls him through. And whereas I would say Jason's turn feels very earned, we don't get enough time early on with Seth in their pre-turn state before they turn to Jesus for it to feel quite as earned. It does feel a bit like blind faith, which is kind of the point, but it just lacked a little bit of something there for me personally. Now, part of that is going to be because I am non-religious, but it's just worth mentioning here. A number of other characters as well. The one that probably gets the most rounding out is the high priest for the cult, who's called Cain. And this threw me out first because obviously Cain and Seth are both names that do hold quite a lot of relevancy to the Bible itself. Obviously Cain being the story of Cain and Abel, who were indeed brothers. So for me and my very limited understanding, that did muddy the waters slightly. But very much shows this character to be very, very self-important. And I think this is an important thing. This is very much somebody who is leading a cult, and as is often the case, people who lead these sort of institutions are very, very rarely looking out for the people around them and just themselves. And their interesting take on the paranoia and the dive into that was actually really interesting to look at, and how it eventually blinded him and undermined him to things that were going on as well was really, really strongly done. The rest of the cast, it was mainly members of the church. They were not especially well fleshed out. We didn't get a massive amount of time with them, partially due to the page turn of the book coming in at under 300 pages, often a problem with slightly shorter books with a relatively moderately sized cast. But you do hit a number of interesting little, not tropes is the wrong word, but things you see in other literature. So, for example, much like in Pets for Legion, you have a member of the church who is a priest who does suffer or has suffered in the past some crisis of faith. And you see an interesting point in the back half of the book where they are actually tempted to leave their flock and reject their what's the word I'm after? Their responsibilities. And that's really interestingly well played out. You have an older woman whose name I can't remember, unfortunately, right now, who is very much, I would say, probably the actual leader of the church and very much almost the moral center of it. And they were interestingly characterized as well, especially towards the end, where they're very much aware of their own oncoming age and the difficulty of everything that's going on and the physical limitations that they have, but as well as them being almost a rock for the people around them because her faith is unyielding. So that works really well overall as well. Just a case where I felt like some of the side characters felt a little bit more two-dimensional than I would have liked. But again, that's made up for especially by the arc that Jason goes through. And also, to be fair, Kane, I did actually find the less morally inclined characters the more interesting ones in this book, which probably says a lot about me. The world building here is a bit of a mixed bag for me. In some ways, it works really well. I like especially the way the spiritual world kind of intercepts and interacts with the real world, with these actual sequences where I suppose I'm going to refer to them as dream sequences here. Not quite the right word to use, but I think they're really well done and they do a really good job of highlighting the different approaches of the church versus the cult in terms of one side using fear and threats to control, whereas the church using a promise of forgiveness and redemption. That is a really powerful message, especially that anyone can be forgiven if they truly repent and work at it. Really appreciate that. And those sequences in particular, the slightly more esoteric ones, do work really, really well for me. I also like the fact that you have this almost layer of blind obedience from the cult, and that actually mirrors quite interesting with the blind faith of the church, and that in itself is quite an interesting parallel as well, because in many ways they hit the same beats but for very, very different reasons. And there's an interesting philosophical discussion you can potentially make there for where those differences truly lie and if it is intense. Not a discussion I'm going to get into, but it's a curious little thought to look at if you're someone like me who isn't religious by nature. Where this does fall, though, is the actual world itself. I have no real sense of scope or scale of where this is taking part. I can't really truly tell if this is just small town America or a big city, how many people are involved in the cult, how many are involved in the church. I don't get a real sense of the numbers involved here. So when you consider the fact you have literal personifications of Jesus potentially and Lucifer, there's a lack of scale here which doesn't quite sit within the story for me personally. And I don't know why it stuck out for me here, because Pets for Legion had a similar thing, but Pets for Legion did explain why you didn't see all these things. It was explained as part of Legion's oversight and influence on that local area, but you don't get the same feeling of it here. And because this is less breakneck in pace, when you're in the more downtime moments, the world almost feels empty and devoid. which is a shame just as a form of giving context to the world. So overall, a mixed bag. The actual religious imagery and stuff like that works really, really well, and the beliefs. But the actual world itself just feels slightly underserved for me personally. Presentation then, we'll start with the cover. I absolutely love the cover. The use of the dagger on the front and the handprints almost representing a promise of blood and how that's going to work. From the green eyes, which not just represent the spirits and the demons involved, but also I would argue envy that Jason feels towards Seth. Does a good job at highlighting some of the themes of the book. In terms of the book itself, technically it is once again written very, very well in terms of some examples of that. The more spiritual and more esoteric sequences where they're almost in a dream state. I really do like how those have been written, and they do an amazing job of driving home the differences in points of view and beliefs of both sides, the dark and the light, and that works really, really well. And also, from a descriptive point of view, those are probably the strongest passages in the book for me personally. Also, sort of piggybacking on that, but especially in the back half, as Seth confronts Jason for the first time since the incident occurred about a year earlier, and the feelings that Seth goes through and Jason trying to tempt him back to the cult are also incredibly well done and quite smartly done as well in a number of places. Also, in terms of pacing, this is a very different pacing to Pets for Legion, with a far more peak and trough effect throughout, with a peak very early on as well, which you don't often see, and then the drop down to all the philosophical musings to take part, so that works pretty well as well. There are a couple of moments in here where you do have some, for me personally, repetition in terms of descriptors. The one that sticks in my head, and I'm not quite sure why, was a descriptor to do with the feeling of hot vomit at the back of someone's throat. I don't know if it was just because it came up in relatively quick succession in subsequent chapters. I'm not quite sure what it is, but that stuck with me. But overall, that was the exception to the rule, and most of the descriptions were pretty well done and varied. And again, especially during the less real world sequences as well. So overall, once again, well written, well presented, amazing cover, and decently paced. Final thoughts. It's really hard to get this into words, and it's taken me a few attempts to try and get this, so hopefully I'll get it this time. On every level, this is just as good, if not slightly better, than Pets for Legion. But there's something, and I don't know what it is, that stopped me enjoying this anywhere near as much. And I don't know what it is, because on an objective level, I find the characters of Seth and Kane and Jason to be far more engaging and interesting in terms of dynamic than the characters from Pets for Legion. I think the strongest scenes in here as well are actually stronger than in that book also. But there's just something where this hasn't worked as well for me. And I'm not sure why. I have a suspicion it comes down to my personal beliefs, as I am not Christian, and the way the pacing has worked, so you've got more of that introspective time. And I'm wondering if it's shaping a little bit against that. I'm not sure. And also, just to touch on the ending here as well, and the ending makes complete sense for the cult. Total, utter, and complete sense. But there's just something about the way it ends that's left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. Even though it makes sense, and I don't know what it is. And I can't put my finger on it. There's just something that feels slightly skewed to me, and I can't pass what it is. On saying that, this is once again a well written, solid Christian horror, and if you like your religious based horror, there is a lot to like here. So overall, I am going to give this 3.5 stars out of 5. Technically good, some interesting characters, some great moments. It just kind of failed the vibe check for me a little bit. But there we go. Thank you once again to Shawn for gifting me a copy of this. I appreciate it so, so much. Have you read this or any religious-based horror yourself? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll catch you soon.